There we go. Now it's official. Welcome, everyone. So pleased that you're all joined us for this wonderful book launch event, which is hosted in part by the University of Chicago Press and by the Seminary Co-op Bookstore here in Chicago. My name is Adrienne Myers. I'm a promotions manager at the University of Chicago Press, and I will be your host and MC for tonight. If you look at the chat, we have a purchase link to purchase our featured book tonight from the Seminary Co-op Bookstore. They said they are wonderful. We want to support them in any way that we can. I've also posted a link to the University of Chicago Press YouTube page, where the recording of tonight's event will be posted probably about a week from today. So to get started, everyone, if you'll keep yourselves muted until the end, cameras on or off, whatever you prefer. I'm gonna do introductions for our two speakers, and then at the very end, we'll open it up to Q&A. And we'll probably have everyone just put your questions in the chat to everyone, and then we'll read those out as they come in. So first up tonight, the author of this gorgeous new book is Ingrid Christian, who's an assistant professor of Germanic studies at the University of Chicago. She has published articles in a range of volumes and contributed to a range of volumes in journals as well, among them PMLA, German Studies Review, and History of Photography. Her new book, Objects in Air, is now available from the University of Chicago Press. Joining us in conversation is Catriona MacLeod, who works in the area of German 18th and 19th century literature, aesthetics, and the visual arts, and is the Frank Curtis Springer and Gertrude Melcher Springer Professor in the College and the Department of Germanic Studies at the University of Chicago. She is the author of Fugitive Objects, Literature and Sculpture in the German 19th Century, which was awarded the Jean-Pierre Botticelli Prize for Best Book in Romanticism Studies, as well as the author of Embodying Ambiguity, Androgyny and Aesthetics from Winkelmann to Keller. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ingrid and Catriona to talk a little bit about the book.
Thank you so much, Adrienne. It's really a privilege to be able to have this conversation with Ingrid today about her splendid and beautifully written new book, which I can only recommend to everyone who is here. I feel quite an affinity with this project because I wrote a book called Fugitive Objects that is sort of a twinsy to this book, insofar as it treats sculpture and its dissolution around 1800. But we're here to talk about Ingrid's book, which is really fantastic. And I wish I could raise a glass and toast it, but it's nevertheless marvelous to see so many colleagues and especially Ingrid's family here this afternoon. That's really a pleasure. And I know it's also an international affair for you, Ingrid. So the first question I would like to ask you is how you came to this project. What were the origins of this thinking for you, and what was the genesis of the book?
So the book, the initial idea came actually from a poetry class that I took as a graduate student at Princeton with Stanley Korngold, who was teaching there at the time. And the class was on poetry around German poetry around 1900. We read Nietzsche, Hofmannsthal, Stefan George, and then the last one was Rilke. And when I read Rilke's Elegies, I was somehow so taken with the elegies that I wrote a paper on them, spent a lot of time thinking about them. And it was in the elegies that I thought I noticed this idea of a kind of a material or sensible spatiality, a kind of space, a way to take space, kind of negative space, and turn it into a positive entity and make it somehow sensible or quasi-material. And I thought that somehow Rilke evoked that in his poetry, but also enacted it somehow. Rilke's poetry is famous for having these strong atmospheric effects. When you read Rilke, you're supposed to be so overcome, inspired. His poetry has an atmospheric radiance. And I thought that the two, somehow this effect and the actual like thematic evocations mirrored each other. And that's how I just became really interested in sensible, in a kind of quasi-material spatiality. And later, when I revisited those poems, I realized that actually the way Rilke does it is by writing about air, and that air is the figure of this material space. And then I somehow went from there. So the starting point was actually poetry, which it didn't make it into the book in the end. I published that separately, but that was the origin.
And it's always wonderful to hear about the effects of graduate seminars, isn't it?
Yes.
I find that wonderful. So I wanted to ask you if you could speak more about your interdisciplinary cast of characters who are the focus of your book. We have 2 art critics, a poet, and a choreographer. So I wonder if you could give our audience here a sense of why them, and what do they have to do with one another?
Yeah, of course. So maybe before I introduce them, I can briefly say in 3 sentences what the book is about and how they kind of come together in the book. So in the book, I became interested in artworks that don't stop at their material boundaries, that artworks that somehow are unbounded and that continue into their environing space or the air around them. And then when I looked at this closer, I realized that the medium of their continuity, of their unboundedness, is air. And furthermore, when I looked at my art critics and figures of study, objects of study, I also noticed that they think about the space around an artwork in terms of an environment or milieu, or in German, the words are Umgebung, Umwelt, Milieu. So I then also realized that that's not accidental, but rather they actually, they read Darwin, and they really engaged with the biological sciences at the time, around 1900. So it's a kind of aesthetic ecology, if you wish. So that somehow is what, in a way, briefly what the book is about. And then the 4 figures are Abi Warburg, who was a German Jewish art historian from Hamburg, a very important figure who changed the discipline of art history. He was also a cultural historian, so he really opened up art history to cultural history. He worked in a very interdisciplinary way. Although he was trained in Renaissance art, he combined anthropology, the history, comparative study of religions, literature and poetry with his study of art. He was also an early figure who was interested in low art and high art, and in visual studies broadly understood, in something that, I don't know, in the 90s became en vogue, but that's something that he, as a build historic or historian of images, that he did so at the beginning of the 20th century. And he is also famous, this is the last point about him, for viewing images as media for cultural memory. So he would look, and maybe I can share an image here quickly. So he would look at, oops, maybe I should do the slideshow. He would look at Botticelli's Birth of Venus and became interested in the movement of the hair and the textiles. And he realized that the way the textiles and the hair move in the air is a way for early Renaissance artists, for Botticelli in this case, to quote the ancient models of movement. So he really kind of zoned in on these small details and recognized in them the cultural memory of a past time. He recognized, he somehow understood or argued that in these small details, in these minutiae, the early Renaissance artists remembered and cited, referenced antiquity. So he was really interested in images as kind of media for cultural memory. So he's the figure of the first chapter, and I can give you a sense of how he fits into the book's broader argument. One of the things he claims, he as he studies these minutiae, well, it's not something he claims explicitly. It's something that I kind of, after reading his text a few times, I thought I recognized the connection between these aerial accessories in motion, the draperies and the hair on the one hand, that move in the painting, that are depicted in the painting, and then the so-called atmosphere, the cultural atmosphere of the early Renaissance in Florence around Botticelli. And he never makes this connection between the air in the depicted aerial phenomena in the painting and the air of the times in Florence around Botticelli, the atmosphere at that time. He doesn't make that explicit, but it's somehow there in his writing, in his prose, and it's kind of it's the reader's task to draw out these implications. So this is one way in which he moves between the air within the image to the air around, in this case, metaphorical air, or the cultural milieu around the artwork. The other three, I'll keep it a bit shorter because this was a bit longer than planned, but the other figure is Alois Riegel, who is also an art historian. He was an Austrian art historian who is famous as a founding figure, a key figure of the Vienna School of Art History, which was interested in applying empirical, positivist, formalist methods of study to art. So they were not interested in making judgments about artworks. They didn't believe that there were periods of decline in the history of art, as many did at the time. For example, late Roman art was supposedly a period of decline, early medieval art as well. But instead, he said, instead of making value judgments, you should have these rules that you can apply to examine artworks. Those were kind of formalist study rules, essentially. You know, what is the relationship between figure and ground? How does it change over the course of time? And he's an important theorist who also points forward to what is to come, reception theory, structuralism. So the second chapter is on Riegel, and the third chapter is on Rilke, but not his poetry, but rather his writings on Rodin. And I won't say more about Rilke. I guess I can say that he's one of the most significant German language poets of the 20th century. Also someone who is very popular and still very much read. Last fall, I taught a course on Rilke as self-help literature, which is a little unkind perhaps to Rilke, but he kind of has this still this great popularity. And then the last figure, which is the chapter on dance, is Rudolf Laban, who was a Hungarian speaker born in Slovakia, also in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, like Rilke as well. And he was a choreographer, a dancer, and a theorist. And he is famous, especially as a dance theorist and as someone who laid the pedagogical foundations for modern European dance. Between the two world wars, there were, for example, very few European cities without a Laban school. And he's also famous for a dance movement notation system that he developed that used to be used more in the past when you didn't have video recordings, but is used less nowadays. However, something to keep in mind about Laban In 1934, he was the director of the German Dance Theater, which was under the auspices of Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda. And eventually his work was deemed hostile to the state, and he left Germany in 1937 to England, but at least for 3 years he worked for the Nazis, and then went to England in 1937 and lived there and perhaps until the 60s, I think, as a movement analyst. So these are the 4 figures, and one way to think about the chapters is that they have an increasing, they move in increasingly sensuous spatialities. So the first one is on painting, Warburg on Botticelli's painting, which is a kind of less, painting's relationship to space is less intense, let's say. Then Regal chapter is on sculptural relief, which sometimes seen as something between painting and sculpture. Then the Rilke chapter on Rodin is on sculpture. And then finally, the chapter on dance is the most intensely relational, spatial, kind of the most intense relationship between body and space in dance. That's the last chapter. Okay, I'll stop here. Sorry that this was a longer response.
Thank you for sharing this floaty image from Botticelli. I think this takes us to the topic of air, which is what I wanted to explore a little bit further with you. Around 1900, air seems to have many meanings, and you explore a variety of them in your book in really interesting ways. Air appears to be a void, a vacuum, or it can be filled with various things. It can be toxic or polluted, health-giving or toxic. And I wondered if you could just elaborate a little bit more on why air is so important around 1900.
Yeah, so I see maybe there are 3 points to the context for understanding air. I think one of them for me, and in the project, air is really a figure, a kind of is the figure for a material articulation of space. It's a kind of a material expression of space at a time when these categories, space and matter, become problematic concurrently in the history of science. So at the end of the 19th century, with the discovery of the electron, of radioactivity, the boundaries of matter are no longer so clearly circumscribed. They become more tenuous. And at the same time, space itself, with visions of electromagnetic fields, space itself, or the ether, space itself is envisioned as being filled with a quasi-substance. And ether theories, of course, go back also to the ancients, but they had a revival in the 19th century, and this simultaneous kind of space and matter becoming simultaneously problematic makes air into an ideal figuration of this inability to clearly distinguish space from matter. It becomes the site for this undistinguishability, and you can think about it. You can kind of see it envisioned in discourses of the aura, in the occult, or effluvia, in which bodies also don't end at their material boundaries, but kind of reach beyond themselves. You can see this arguably in Impressionism's atmospheric dissolutions between figure and ground. It's kind of hard to know where you end. But then the second kind of this would be the domain of physics, and air somehow standing in for something that happens in the discourse of physics, for these materialized spaces and dissolving materialities. The other context comes from biology, and there air becomes a kind of a quintessential figure for the notion of the milieu or environment, what happens is that these kind of subtle substances of physics, or the media from physics, these space-filling fluids like the ether, eventually become biology's milieus. For example, Newton's medium is translated into French as milieu, and eventually becomes the milieu of biology and sociology. And air somehow is a kind of privileged trope for the idea of milieu. And then a last point, there are other more concrete developments in this period. Air somehow as a medium comes to the forefront with various technological advances like aviation, telegraph, radio, on the one hand. On the other hand, with various cultural trends like naturism, various return to nature movements as reactions to the conditions of modernity, kind of fresh air obsessions, climate therapy revivals in the period. So it's somehow it's more it's present. It becomes particularly present as a human environment in the period. And in closing, I would just say that that what you can see in these two poles, somehow the physics aspect of kind of materialized space versus the biology aspect of milieu. And milieu, for example, already in Diderot's and D'Alembert's dictionary was translated as material space. So these would be two poles of air as medium, in the sense of medium of transmission, as in physics, and air as medium in the sense of milieu, kind of milieu of subsistence. And in the book, air is both. It is a medium for the transmission of aesthetic effects. This is in the context of reception, of how an artwork reaches out to you, moves you, or touches you. But on the other hand, it's also a milieu, kind of this kind of spatiality, the concrete spatiality, the space in which the artwork exists in a very concrete sense, the artwork as object.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think that your answer really gave a flavor of the compelling interdisciplinarity of this book project that touches on subjects as varied as occult spirit photography and the Luftkur around 1900 and biology and physics and aesthetics. There are so many interesting facets to this. The one that I want to turn to now is I think the sociological and ideological dimension of milieu. And I just want to add that one of the things that your book does so wonderfully is give us an elaboration of what milieu theory meant for art critics around 1900, but you also provide us with a very rich and detailed milieu for each of your authors, which I very much appreciate. And I'm sure other readers will also. But could you talk a bit more about the ideological dimensions of milieu, which obviously is connected with Taine's notion of milieu in France?
Yes. So I think what is interesting is that the notion of milieu is closely tied to that of the idea of organism, and the relationship between organism and milieu is analogous to the relationship between figure and ground, or form and space in aesthetics. But these writers on art really are inspired by kind of biological thinking about the relationship between organisms and space. And in another context in which organism proves a fruitful kind of productive metaphor are discussions of what kind of political frameworks, what is a state? And actually in similar ways, just as an artwork was conceived to be an organic form in the sense of it being a self-enclosed form in 18th century, early 19th century aesthetics, the state was also conceived or somehow modeled on the example of an organism, or was understood as an organism. But then in the course of the 19th century, after Darwin's work, but also after Hippolyte Taine's work, then you could say that just as organisms need, for example, organisms expand beyond themselves or kind of spatially extend themselves in theories of milieu, in which you don't end at your ectodermal boundaries, but are in continuity with your surrounding space, then you could make the argument that the state and various nations also need to spatially extend. And this is where a related term in this context, term related to milieu, is that of Lebensraum, or living space, kind of an ideology of the National Socialists, but already earlier in Imperial Germany as well. So this would be kind of the other side of this logic of uncontainment, and the kind of politically deeply problematic side of going beyond yourself. And I think my figures, for example, Riegel, he draws, all of my figures actually, I think, well, definitely Riegel and Warburg quote Taine, or indirectly reference Hippolyte Taine and his dictum about race, milieu, moment. And Riegel pairs it with a kind of cultural essentialism in which, for instance, the Italians, or in the South, they are this way, and you can see that in the paintings, and the Dutch or the Northerners are that way, and you can see it in the paintings. So this would be kind of some of the politics of this externalism, of this logic of externalization. The other one, the last one that I will bring up, is of course there in the work of Laban, in Laban's theory of dance. Laban was very interested in the relationship between dancer, body, and space, and he argued that that a dancer does not just mold or create bodily shapes, but also molds her immediate surrounding space and creates these body space forms, these continuities. And then he extends this immediate space around the dancer into a notion of nature, kind of oneness. The dancer reenacts the oneness between humans and nature. And then finally, a kind of Vitruvian oneness between microcosm and macrocosm. But there is also a problematic side to this oneness, and that is when this oneness is kind of racially and nationalistically conceived as one superior race. And that's something that you can see in Laban's so-called movement choirs, these collective dances in which bodies move in unison, kind of in unity, and reenact this kind of all-extensive oneness that, however, is not, you're not one with the other as other, but rather you're one as one singular nation or race. So these would be some of the kind of political aspects that I would highlight at this point.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. I'm hoping I have time for just a couple of more questions, and that then we can open it up to questions from the audience. I see there's already one there, an excellent question. But I wanted to ask you something a little bit more personal, and that has to do with your own approach to the material as someone who is trained in literary criticism, literary scholarship. I feel this because this is how I also do my scholarship. So if you have answers for me, that would also be really great. The questions I have are, how do you see yourself as a literary scholar writing about art criticism, choreography, and sculpture? And I see two angles on this that are very interesting and fulfilling in your book, I think. One is that you pay attention to the language of Riegel and Warburg, for example, in ways that yield a lot, that perhaps have not so far been fully explored in art historian scholarship on these two figures. I hope I'm not saying anything out of place there for my art historian colleagues. And the second aspect, which I found wonderful in your writing, was that you coin or you use some rather unusual words yourself, such as the marvelous extravagation, which seems to imply sort of the vagaries of air. Also, it seems to be somehow connected with a kind of extravagance or sort of exuberance of this projection of the artwork into air. So if you could speak a little bit to your own approach to the material as a literary scholar, that would be excellent, I think.
Yes, thank you so much. I think that this is an excellent question. I would say that sometimes, so people have often commented on the interdisciplinarity of the project, but I have to say that I myself sometimes perceived it as less interdisciplinary, because it is, all the chapters are primarily literary studies of the literature of art history. So they are kind of literary criticism or close readings of art writings, Warburg's writings on painting, and Riegel's writings, Rilke's, and Laban's on dance. So the book is really, there are some visual analyses, but the book in a way is centered around words, and sometimes individual words. And I think my approach is, for example, with Riegel, my approach was to somehow bracket everything I had heard about Riegel before, which was all about the optical and the tactile and the kind of close view and distant view. Because after a while, it becomes somehow, that language becomes opaque, and I felt it doesn't yield anymore. And I thought I have to look at these texts on their own terms. And then some of the work that I did is just, I'm afraid, more old-fashioned kind of detective philological work, in which I read and I notice words, and I read all the footnotes, and there were so many amazing things I found in Riegel's footnotes. All the references to biology and theories of organism and cell biology were all in the footnotes. So I think this kind of a more perhaps pedantic attention to language, that is what really somehow that fascinates me, words and how they mean and how their meanings change. So I worked with etymological dictionaries and historical semantics and tools like this, and I also felt that for my methodology, Warburg was one model in a sense, because I focused in on minutiae, like Warburg, what you see here on the screen, the particular movement of a drapery or a textile. But I felt that those minutiae eventually yielded a lot. Once I somehow sat with Riegel's text, I realized all the references to Impressionism and how he builds his theories of figure and ground in late Roman art, how those are so inflected by his view and his reaction to Impressionist art of his own time. But that required a kind of willingness to engage with the linguistic labor of each of my figures. And some of that I quite enjoy. It's what I like to do, but some of it, because these were not literary texts, at times it was quite hard, because it was not like reading Kafka or the poetry of Rilke, or I don't know, something else, but rather reading formal kind of technical texts in a literary way can at times be a little draining, or so every now and then I really missed reading literature.
Wonderful. So I also love footnotes, by the way. Any number of projects start with footnotes, I believe. If I may just ask one last question before the Q&A more generally begins, opening up the project a little bit more to other contemporary theoretical concerns. I wondered how you see your project in relation to eco-criticism, environmental humanities on the one side, and on the other, the other theoretical framework that came to me was thing theory or object theory. Your project doesn't really seem to fit into either one of these categories necessarily, but I wondered if you could talk more about that. Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you for this question. So, yes, I think so. Eco-criticism, or environmental humanities. I think so this book is, in a sense, it's about art theory, or also about art theory, but it's not. My work is not theoretical in the way in which I see environmental humanities as being theoretical. I see that as more interested in kind of philosophical and conceptual speculations as well, whereas my work is more, in the way that I just described it a minute ago, more inductive. It works with these very concrete examples, concrete words, concepts, and then kind of extracts a theory from those. So it's perhaps grounded in a different way than some work in environmental humanities that I at least encountered. And then the political dimension is also different, because it's a historical political dimension. It's kind of and the political dimension, kind of the horizon is national socialism with the work of Laban, but that's a historical political thrust, not political in the sense in which eco-criticism and environmental humanities are. And I would also say, though, that one aspect, one political framework that I do see present in other environmental humanities work, and also in this book, is this, this notion of connectivity, of connectivity. I said it can be problematic, as in the case of Laban's movement choirs and these collective dances, but it can also be a kind of a politically redeeming notion of oneness and connection. And then finally, I mean, there's the interdisciplinary aspect that I also see as similarities with other environmental humanities studies. And then think theory, I came across it, I remember, of course, when I thought about this project. It didn't seem, it doesn't seem like a perfect fit, because I was less interested in what happens to things or things and objects and the difference between them than I wanted to think about something that is not a thing becoming a thing. Maybe more, and maybe media theory is more helpful here. The oscillation between a thing and a medium, which is what that oscillation that I described between matter and space is also about, and the space surrounding an artwork becoming somehow a category in its own right, an aesthetic category in its own right, not just a negative factor, but rather somehow becoming a quasi thing in itself. So but I think there is some work on atmospheres as quasi things. So maybe that direction, there are more resonances with that, that kind of work that I can think of just now.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. Adrienne, shall we turn it over to you to moderate? Or Ingrid, did you see the questions in the chat?
Yes, I can open the chat. I can also stop the share.
Yeah, we can do either way. Ingrid, do you want to read the questions out, or would you rather?
Yeah, sure.
Cool.
I'll just. Oh yeah, so Eric, at the moment, this is from Eric Zantner. At the moment, we are still a bit preoccupied with air as the medium for the transmission of germs. Does the notion of contagion play a role in your thinking? Do works of art contaminate us? Do they need air to do that? Does viewing works of art on a screen, as we are doing now, protect us as a kind of social distancing from art? Okay, thank you so much, Eric. So actually, I have lots of thoughts on this. So there is a figure who didn't make it into the book, but that I wrote, Camilo City, who was an Austrian urban planner living around the same time as Riegel, a little bit before him, and he was very interested in artworks, especially monuments that are exhibited in cities or spatially exposed in cities, and he thought about them in terms of aesthetic effects or Wirkungsästhetik, as figures that enhance the picturesque quality of a city. And those he conceived of them as very much in terms of effects that travel to us viewers. But the other side of his thinking about these artworks was that he felt they should not be spatially exposed. So think about when you walk around perhaps in an Italian old city, and then you turn a little corner and you have this amazing cathedral in front of you, or this incredible statue. Those are not spatially exposed. They're embedded in the medieval texture of the city. And that for Zitte, who was quite upset about the Haussmannization of Vienna, that was the picturesque, because there was this connection between a monument and its surrounding architecture and space, instead of having something stand in an empty plaza or an empty square. And he thought we need more of that. But he realized that as an urban planner as well, he realized those kind of the transmission of those aesthetic effects is in opposition with the transmission of epidemiological agents, because he knew that part of the Haussmannization projects was part of urban public hygiene, how to design the city in a way where it's not conducive to the spread of disease, and these medieval entangled cities were much more conducive to the spread of disease. So his work, something that I left out, I think would speak very directly to Eric's question, how to balance the picturesque effects, kind of us being in an aesthetically pleasing environment versus us being in an infectious environment, and how can you balance these two? I do think that in a sense, these artworks, the way, of course, when they become unbounded, and reach out to us, they also contaminate us. I guess we could say that. But contamination does not, other than this left out Camilo City part, it does not play a role in the book. But I'd have to think a bit more about whether viewing works of art on a screen, as we are doing now, does it protect us as a kind of social distancing from art? I don't know, but I'd have to think more. I feel like Benjamin's aura would probably be relevant here, but I'd have to think about it a bit more. I'll look at the next question. Oh yeah, so to add, Eric's other question was, do we need language and even poetic language to register the materiality at issue in the expansiveness of works of art? So the argument of the book is, I think very much is that it is that this expansiveness or this spatio-material quality of the artwork's externalism, it comes into its own in the writings, in the descriptions, in the language. It is not, so it's really somehow, the medium of language is what really brings this out, what makes it alive, what makes it come to life. And
materiality actually requires language. Like in a way, it's materiality has to be realized poetically, I guess, before we actually, in another, we think of materiality as being brute. But here you're basically saying that language kind of allows the materiality to matter, you know.
Yeah, actually, and I feel that's maybe a dual thrust of the project. On the one hand, it feels a bit like new materialism, but on the other hand, that new materialism and that materialist thrust of the project is built on the metaphorical qualities of the word, of language, of etymological affinities, and of metaphor too, very much on metaphor, as you saw with the case of Warburg, like atmosphere, air within the painting, atmosphere around Botticelli. So this would be a kind of dual thrust, a kind of material and a very kind of poetic, metaphorical one.
As well as I think of this ekphrastic project, which has to do with animation, if you will. I think there's another question in the chat. Yeah.
So I'm intrigued by the notion that Botticelli's painting enacts a kind of cultural memory, recalling the ancients through movement of Venus's hair and robes. Is there also a temporal dimension or a form of remembrance at work in the concept of the expansive habitat or Lebensraum? When we try to exceed our biological boundaries, is this mostly a forward-looking undertaking, or is there an aspect of cultural memory there too? Yeah, so actually there is, in the book, this question of temporal, I think I have a section on temporalecstasis, and it becomes relevant actually in the Rilke chapter, and Rilke thinks about this, I think, in the ways in which Rachel just describes it. So this expansiveness and this notion of ecstasis is inspired by Heidegger, and his notion of this is actually, his notion of it is temporal. But I reconfigure it into something spatial, but in Rilke, it is kind of both. And the way Rilke understands it is that he will often describe Rodin's sculptures as artworks that reach back to their ancient past, in that they reference artworks of antiquity, but also in that they are made of stone and rock, of kind of a so hence a geological past. But they also, at the same time, Rilke envisions them in a very distant future. So he has these really extensive temporal spans that reach from the very distant past to a distant future, a kind of future time of reception, in which who will see them, how will they survive? That I think this temporal kind of unending quality of the artwork reflects the spatially expansive quality of it in Rilke's writing.
Thank you. That was really helpful.
Anyone else has questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We probably have time for one more question or so. And if not, we can wrap up and say thanks to our wonderful hosts. Let's see. Last call for questions. All right. Well, let's give Catriona and Ingrid a big round of virtual applause. Thank you so much for being here and presenting for our By the Book series with the Seminary Co-op. I put the link in the chat again to purchase this book, and also the link to our YouTube page where the event video will be posted probably in a week or so. I'm gonna stop the recording, but feel free to hang out and unmute yourselves and say hello and goodbye.